Good afternoon and welcome to the Daily Journal's Capitol View webcast. I am your host, Chris Kiefer, managing editor for multimedia here at the Daily Journal. And as always, we are joined by Daily Journal Capitol Bureau Chief Bobby Harrison. Bobby, what's going on today?
Not much, Chris. We postponed it for a day to let the weather roll in so we could do it on a gloomy day so more people be inside able to watch. I'm sure that was our planning.
Yeah.
And in fact, I had a dental appointment.
No, I think you planned the dental appointment just so that it would all line up just right. But what better thing to do on a rainy day than talk state politics, right?
Right.
Well, we've got a busy show today, as always, but there's a lot of topics that you've written about in the last week that I want to get into. We're going to talk a little bit about the Mississippi Senate District 10 election last week. That's district that covers Marshall and Tate counties in northeast Mississippi. But the eventual winner of that, Neal Whaley, didn't announce his party affiliation until after he won the election, and we'll talk through that a little bit. There was also a proposal that you wrote about from a Gulf Coast legislator that would really significantly change the way the legislature operates, and they can only pass non-budget bills every other year, and I want to hear more about that. But I want to start with something you wrote about this weekend, and I know you've got another story on it in tomorrow's paper looking further, but we've talked before. The budget proposals have come out. Governor Phil Bryant made his a couple weeks ago. The legislative leaders made theirs a couple weeks ago. And, that's kind of giving you a lot of material to kind of look at different things. But one of the aspects, they both propose level funding for the Mississippi Adequate Education Program, which is the money that goes to school districts. But they propose cuts to the general education budget, which is, I guess, the money that's used for the State Department of Education. Tell us a little bit about that.
That's right, Chris. They both the governor's budget and the budget proposed by the Legislative Budget Committee, which is chaired and co-chaired by Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves and Speaker Philip Gunn, both propose cuts in the general education budget. And Chris, it's important. I mean, MAEP money does go directly to the school districts, and the general education budget, as they called it, does go to fund the State Department of Education, but a lot of that money also goes directly to the school districts or out for programs that are run to the school districts, like literacy coaches to ensure that kids are reading on a certain grade level by the time they exit the third grade, or money for early childhood education programs and a bunch of other stuff like that. And that both proposals cut the budget for general education. The cut from the budget committee is, I think, about 3%.
Yeah, I've got those numbers right now, Bobby. I can give those for you. It's a 3.9%. Let me switch the camera over and pull that back up. 3.9% from the budget committee, which is $6.6 million. Bryant's proposal is $10 million, so it's even deeper.
Yeah, and what makes Bryant's proposal even a little bit significantly deeper is while he's cutting the overall budget, he's proposing a $10 million increase from $3 million to $13 million for a program that provides vouchers or scholarships for special education students to attend private schools. So if that was funded as Governor Bryant wants to be funded, there'd be another significant cut in the other aspects of the general education budget. So these would be, and these cuts come on top of double-digit cuts that Department of Education and other agencies have faced over the past couple of years as revenue has not met expectations and it has been sluggish. So we just have to see where this goes. The special education voucher program, that was viewed as a big win for the school choice folks, the folks who want to expand school choice in Mississippi. You could argue it's the biggest win they've had under the current program as it is structured now. I think about 435 scholarships or vouchers were awarded for this current school year. Most of those vouchers are located in the Jackson area where there's more private schools. There's very few of those vouchers go to Northeast Mississippi students, but it essentially provides about $6,500 for a special education student to leave the public schools and go to a private school. The people who support the program say, a lot of the time the parents and the kids in the special education kids in the public schools, excuse me, I'm stuttering through this, are not getting the education services that they deserve and need. And the flip side of that is people say that, that this money doesn't really help deal with special education issues, but it just provides vouchers to a select few. There's about 65,000 students with some type of special education designation, and this, the $3 million provided vouchers for about 435. If the governor's proposal came through, it would increase that number to increase by about 1,500 students, I believe.
Wow.
The important thing to remember here, Chris, is this is a second year in the program. In the first year of the program, they didn't use all of the $3 million allocation. And
I was going to ask that,
whether they're going to use all the allocation for the current school year. So the governor could be making a suggestion to dramatically increase the money going to a program that's not even being used right now to its to the maximum that is allowed in the current law. So during the first year they used about 2/3 of the $3 million. This year they changed the law, so a kid does not have to, under the original law, a kid would have had to be in the public school the year before they got the money to go to the private school. But now a kid could already be in the private school, and his parents already paying for private school tuition, and they could apply for this voucher and get money to help pay for that to pay for that tuition. So it's a some people say it's a needed program. Other people say it's a controversial program that takes money away from the public schools that have been underfunded dramatically over the past several years.
But if it were to pass, going back, so the Bryant's proposal would cut the budget $10 million. Of course, that's just a proposal. The actual budget will come out when the legislature starts, and the legislature will start in January, and that usually happens toward the end of the process, maybe closer to March. But with this $10 million more for this program, if that happens, that would essentially be a $20 million cut for some of the other general education programs.
Right. I mean, the way it's kind of tricky because they don't. The governor's office and the legislative leadership release these budgets. They don't provide a lot of details as far as how the money's divvied out. But here's what we do know: the governor is proposing a $10 million increase in the budget for the special education voucher program, and he's proposing, I think you said, a $6 million decrease in the general education budget. So if you increase money by $10 million in some area, you're essentially talking about a cut of $16 million, I think it would be, Chris, to other areas of the general education budget if that program was fully funded at the level the governor wants it to be funded.
And you wrote about it comes at a time, of course, everybody, it's going to be a tight budget year. There are going to be budget cuts. And despite that, I think everybody's asking for budget increases in part just to make up for what's been a few lean years in a row. But this potential cut comes at a time, as you wrote in your story, that the State Board of Education and Superintendent Carrie Wright are asking for additional money for some programs such as expanded early childhood education. Of course, there's that state collaborative model right now that works with private and public preschools, and they've been looking for money to expand that. They're looking to expand literacy efforts at the elementary grade level, and I'm guessing a lot of that goes around the third grade reading gate. And
right, that's where that money is directed.
Teachers and students. And then another one is innovation at the high school level. And as you wrote, although the programs all that have been supported by the legislature and the State Board of Education, but what'll happen with the money, will be interesting to follow out, I guess, going forward.
Yeah, the pre-K program, the collaborative that you referenced, that's where the State Department of Education, the State Board of Education, and Dr. Wright want to really ramp up that program right now. I think for the current school year, they're receiving $4 million to provide grants to run collaboratives throughout the state, but there's they can only run a limited number of collaboratives on $4 million. So they want to increase that by $6 million to $10 million. So the governor is focusing, if you will, on the special ed voucher program, and you could argue that the State Board of Education is kind of putting its eggs in the early childhood education basket, and that's where its priority is, and that's where their proposed budget increase, the bulk of it is going. Or the largest chunk of it, I should say. It's not the majority, but that's the largest chunk is going for the early childhood education program.
Sure. Yeah, right. Another issue kind of you wrote about in this is that Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves, House Speaker Philip Gunn, who, as you said, are both on that legislative budget committee. They, I guess, said that their $6 million cut, a lot of that would be a result of eliminating employee positions that haven't been filled in the last 6 months. But a lot of agencies, including the Department of Education, will say the reason that some of those positions haven't been filled have been because of past budget cuts. So you've kind of got that debate. And you also mentioned that Patrice Guilfoyle, spokeswoman for the Department of Education, noted that the department has absorbed cuts in the past and dealt with that. But that there's just not, in her opinion, her statement, that there's just not a lot left, and that more cuts would hurt their ability to help some of these programs and school reform efforts. So,
yeah, the PENS, the unfilled positions, that's kind of a vicious circle, Chris. If you will, kind of look at it this way: the legislature passes a budget that, as you referenced, around January to go into effect on July 1st, and in a big agency like the Department of Education, they have at least several hundred employees, and they get that budget, and they say, well, we're being cut significantly, so we're going to leave these positions unfilled to deal with the cuts we're about to receive, and the positions go unfilled, and then the legislative leadership says, well, they didn't fill these positions, they must not need them, so we'll just cut them out. And that's not always the case. A lot of the times the case is, we might need these positions, but we got to make cuts somewhere. So instead of laying off a person over here, we have an opening here because this person quit or retired 2 weeks ago. So we're just not going to fill that position. So it's a vicious circle, and a lot of these, and it's been going on. This is the way the budget committee has operated for a long time, but with these cuts that's happened over the past couple of years, it's just intensified that process of not filling the unfilled state employee positions.
Sure. About maybe another issue to get into. You covered, of course, last week there was a special election in Senate District 10. Again, as we said, that's Marshall and is it Tate County? I said Tate County. Is it Tate or Benton County?
Tate, Marshall and Tate.
Okay. So it is Marshall and Tate. That's replacing the position of Bill Stone, who was the Senate, I guess, the Senate minority leader. He left to take a position with the Holly Springs Utility Department, and that created an opening. In that election, Neal Whaley defeated Sharon Gibson. But what was particularly interesting about it was what happened with the party affiliation for Neal Whaley. Talk about that.
Yeah, just a little background. In special legislative elections, Chris, generally in general elections, Mississippi, you run as a Democrat or Republican. There's you run in a Republican primary, a Democrat primary. In a special election, there's just, everybody's on the same ballot, and there's no party identification. Now, common sense tell you the person elected in that special election will more than likely run for re-election as a Democrat or Republican. And there were 5 people in the special election, and I quizzed all 5 about what their party identification was going to be, and 4 to 5 said they would be Democrats, and if they won, they would run for re-election as Democrats. Neal Whaley, a young first-time candidate from or Potts Camp, I believe, did not said he hadn't decided what he would. He hadn't thought about whether he'd be a Republican or a Democrat. As it turned out, he made the runoff along with Sharon Gibson, a Holly Springs attorney. And a couple of days before the election, I asked Mr. Whaley again, and he said he was going to focus on the election. He wasn't worried about party identification. He won on last Tuesday night, and within minutes of the votes being counted, Republican Lieutenant Governor Tate Reeves sent out a statement, praising Whaley winning and picking up a receipt for the Republicans. So, so he decided quickly, or as he admitted to me, he had known all along he was going to be a Republican, but he described it as playing a cat and mouse game with his opponents. He said he wasn't trying to hide anything from the voters, but in playing that cat and mouse game with his opponents, as he described it, he did hide from the voters what his party identification would be. I don't know if he would have, as I stated, voters still put him into office not knowing what his party identification was going to be, but it was an unusual circumstance, and some people would say that that was that he was hiding information from the voters. We'll see if that comes back to haunt him when he runs for election in 2019, where he has to be on the ballot as a Republican. We'll see what happens. But what I thought, I suspected all along, Chris. He went back and looked at his final campaign finance reports.
Mm-hmm.
He was getting money from Republican type PACs or Republican leaning group. Well, he got money from the Marshall County Republican Club, so that was a pretty good hint he was going to run as a Republican. But that information came out late in the campaign, and I thought what he would do was wait, a couple of months into the session and announce he was going to become a Republican, and that way it would not, the optics would not quite be as dramatic. Jarring. But the fact that he did it just within minutes after winning the election was a little bit, as you said, jarring. And I think what happened was the state Republican Party, maybe even the National Republican Party was excited to flip a seat. There was reports that was the first seat that's been flipped to the Republican, from Democrat to Republicans, since President Trump was elected. I think they were so excited about that they couldn't hold off, and so they had a announcement to tout that victory.
Even though no one really knew at the election that they were flipping a seat.
Yeah, it was a secret flip.
Right. It's interesting, Bobby, and you wrote your column about this last week. I guess I don't understand, and you said this exact point, in Mississippi, in a state that is super majorities in both chambers of the legislature, strongly Republican. 7 of the 8 statewide office holders are Republican. You don't usually see someone, at least in today's Mississippi, try to hide the fact that he or she is a Republican. As you wrote, it maybe would be different if this was New York or Massachusetts or California or something like that. I mean, what do you think was going on? Why would he be worried that voters in Mississippi would hold being Republican against him?
Well, I mean,
or opponents, I should say.
And I don't know. I don't have I don't know for sure, but I suspect that he just felt that was the quickest way to ensure victory, because District 10 is a tricky district. Most probably 80 or 90% of the districts, legislative districts in Mississippi, you can look at and say, well, this district's going to always vote Democrat, or this district, a few of them you can say always going to vote Democrat, but the others are always going to vote Republican. There's a few true swing districts, if you will, and there's while District 10 is tricky because Marshall County is a heavily Democratic county and Tate County is a heavily Republican county. So there, and then you get into that issue, and you have a if you can get, perfect world, you can get a Democrat in Tate County, or a Republican in Marshall County, you stand a better chance of winning. But it's a tricky district. I guess he just felt that with 4 Democrats in the race, he could just kind of not give a party identification and kind of sneak through, and that's what he did. It worked for him. But it is unusual in Mississippi to see a Republican not willing to stand up and say, hey, I'm a Republican.
Right. And you mentioned he's a political newcomer, and maybe some of it was that too. It's just not being experienced with the process. And I don't know. It's interesting. You don't see that hardly ever.
Yeah. So. And I think I mentioned in my column, it's going to be interesting to see what happens in 2019. Is there going to be somebody running against him in a Republican primary saying, he was, back in the special election, he was not even willing to say he was a Republican. What kind of Republican is this? So we'll see if, that happens, or if there's somebody running a Democrat primary who can make hay by the fact that he was kind of hid this information from voters. We'll see if that, comes back to sort of bite him in the 2019 statewide elections. Yeah,
sure. See what the ordinary voters have a short memory, and that's by that time it's old news. That'll be interesting, like you said. One more issue, Bobby, before we go. You wrote last week an interesting proposal by Henry Zuber, who's a Republican representative, so he's in the House from Ocean Springs, is talking about the possibility of, I guess, changing right now. Of course, the Mississippi legislature meets every year. And as that process is about to start again, they start, right at the beginning of January and go about 3 months. It's a little bit longer session, the first session of a new term. But anyway, that's general bills in the beginning, budget bills at the end, so forth. His proposal would only allow them to pass non-budget bills every other year. So they would still meet every year, and could still pass budget and bond bills, but they could only pass, basically laws in general, again, non-budget bills every other year. Walk us through that. What is the thought process behind that?
Well, I mean, it's an unusual proposition. I mean, there's a handful of legislatures that meet every other year. Meet. I think Texas does that. There's like I said, 5 or 6 that do it. Until the early 70s, Mississippi only met every other year, as most legislatures did back then. What he is proposing would not require change in the Constitution, because the legislature would still meet every year on the first Tuesday after the first Monday.
Right.
So it's this year the legislature is gonna go into session as early as it ever can, which will be on January 2nd. Much to my chagrin, I should say. I like to have a couple of days to decompress from New Year's football games.
The whole season, right?
Yeah, but at any rate, they're going to meet on January 2nd. I mean, his proposal, they had passed a budget every year, and they would also be allowed to take up, as you said, bond bills up, technical term would be revenue bills. And that would be, essentially, bond bills of, states selling bonds to finance long-term construction projects, or tax bills, if you tax bills, if a tax increase or a tax decrease. You can take that up every year, but the general bills that you said just could be taken up every other year under Zuber's proposal. And his reasoning is that that would give sort of a cooling off period. He argued that if the legislature had more time to think about a bill before it passed it, they might consider, well, do we really need that bill or not? And he said that a few bills that have to be passed right at that moment, that they could that take a year to study and whether that bill is actually needed. And there's some merit to that, I think. And as he pointed out, that there was an emergency situation where a bill did need to be passed, the governor had always had the option to call a special session at any time. His proposal is a little different, Chris, in that a lot of states do budgets every other year, or 2-year budgets, if you will. But under his proposal, and it may be the only one, his proposal, I think, maybe the only one in the nation where the budget would be done every year, but the bond bills could only be done. I mean, the general bills could only be done every other year. And Zuber's an interesting character. He was the first one, talking about legislation was needed to prevent political types, politicians from spending campaign contributions on personal expenses. That got to be sort of pretty common in the state, and he had filed that legislation every year to stop that practice. And finally, this past session, it finally passed. So he's got a history of sort of taking up long shot proposals that ultimately are passed. So we'll see if he can do that with this particular piece of legislation. I seriously doubt he can, but it's an interesting proposal to think about and to talk about.
Yeah, and you said in your story, you said it probably is a long shot, but that he does have at least the ear of the House leadership. Is that right?
Yeah. I could see, I guess, going into election year, this would be sort of, something that I think a lot of people could hang their hats on, saying, look what we did. We limited the legislature, that would play well with the electorate probably. So maybe it might go somewhere. What's the old? I think Mark Twain's. What was he saying about hiding women and children when the legislature was in town? So I can't remember exactly what it was. It was a glib saying that I think it was Twain. I
don't know this one, Bobby. I'm gonna see if I can Google it quickly.
Will Rogers, I think it was one of those, but I can't remember. But and I went back and looked at the vote when the constitutional amendment was passed in 1970, I believe. or 69 to require the legislature to meet every year. That didn't pass by a wide margin. Usually those constitutional amendments in most cases pass by pretty wide margins, but that one was actually pretty close. So I think it might be a popular proposal to, anytime you talk about limiting the ability of the legislature to take up bills, that might be something that would be popular with the citizens.
Yeah, I guess you never know. So we'll see where it goes. And you even mentioned in your story, and I couldn't find that quote, by the way, but you mentioned your story, it doesn't necessarily. I don't know. We'll have to keep digging. That wouldn't even necessarily mean that it would be a shorter session. As you wrote, in 1969, legislatures were still meeting every other year, but they had a special session that went from July to October. So just because they weren't passing bills every year or general bills every year, it doesn't necessarily mean you get a little more downtime there, Bobby.
Yeah, that was I've looked into that session. That was an interesting time. That was when in 69, or was it 69 or 68? 69?
Let me see again. 69.
69. That's when Mississippi finally opted into the federal Medicaid program. That was an interesting story in itself. Mm-hmm. And then also in the midst of that special session, I believe Hurricane Camille hit. Was ravaged the Gulf Coast and South Mississippi. So that was an interesting time in Mississippi's history.
Yeah, sure it was. All right, well, thanks again. Thanks, Bobby, for your insight as always, and thanks to everyone for joining us. Remember, you can catch Capitol View normally every Monday at 2:00. When we change schedule, we'll put it out on the Daily Journal's Twitter account, and you can see that at DJournal Now on Twitter. But anyway, you can catch us live, like I said, generally 2:00 on Mondays. We're about to be getting really busy with the legislative session starting next month and going into the spring. And again, those episodes are also available on replay, again, at our website, djournal.com, or on our Facebook page. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you next week.